Salutations, respected viewers. I am George from Ireland, and behind me is Neville Chamberlain's house in London. So I'm on Eaton Square, which is one of the most chic addresses in the whole city. So Neville Chamberlain is best known as having been the Prime Minister who pursued an appeasement policy in the late 1930s with catastrophic consequences. And as I'll explain later, I think that history has judged Neville Chamberlain too harshly. He was born in Birmingham in 1869. His father, Joseph Chamberlain, was the Lord Mayor of Birmingham. So the Chamberlain family, they dominated Birmingham politics for about 60 years. Joseph Chamberlain was in fact born in London and moved to Birmingham as an infant. He started working in a factory as a clerk. He worked his way up through the management structure, eventually became a very affluent businessman, and was known as Radical Joe, was in the Liberal Party, and was on the radical fringe of the party, as his sobriquet suggests, and really believed in raising taxes, spending public money to improve the lot of the working class, building social housing and so forth. So Joseph Chamberlain, he was also known for his monocle. Then things changed. So 1886, it came to light that the leader of the Liberal Party, William Ewart Gladstone, had done a volte-face on Home Rule for Ireland and now believed that in Ireland we ought to have Home Rule. Well, that was too much for Joseph Chamberlain, who was a conventional liberal in every other sense, on free trade, on retrenchment, on trying to keep the peace, on ending privilege and things like that. So he broke away from the Liberal Party, taking about a third of the party with him, forming the Liberal Unionists. So the Liberal Unionists and the Conservatives, they worked together for decades, and they gradually merged. Sometimes Liberal Unionists and Conservatives together are simply called the Unionists. But by the 1920s, the distinction didn't really exist, although it existed in theory right up until the 1960s, well, they were National Liberals, and by then they were fully absorbed into the Conservatives. Anyhow, so Joseph Chamberlain had married young, and his first wife gave birth to his son, Austen Chamberlain. She died. Joseph Chamberlain remarried, and then Neville Chamberlain was born with his second wife. There were a few daughters as well, but they're not important in this political story. Anyhow, so back to Neville Chamberlain. He went to rugby school. He's the only Prime Minister to attend that one. You think they might have tried to forget him, but no, they've got a Neville Chamberlain room in his honour. And then he went to Mason College, Birmingham, which has since morphed into Birmingham University. So by this time, it's around about 1900, the family was very prominent. He was running the family business for a while, and they had assets around the world, including a plantation growing sisal in the Bahamas. So he was elected to Parliament for the family seat of Birmingham Edgbaston, and his father was a prominent figure in the Liberal Party, Liberal Unionists, around 1900. Time of the Boer War, started to become known as Imperial Joe, and thought that imperialism could be a very liberal thing, since it was animated by liberal principles if you wanted to spread parliamentary government or freedom of expression or free trade and things like that, and it was uplifting the benighted people of other continents. You may say that's self-serving tripe, but that was the rhetoric. However, the Unionists, they lost an election very heavily in 1906, and Joseph Chamberlain died not long thereafter. And he was quite upset because the Conservatives were increasingly moving towards tariff reform, which is, say, imperial preferences. Taxes on imports from outside the British Empire encouraged people inside the empire to buy imperial products, whether it's from Canada or Australia or Kenya or India or Malaya, buy imperial. And this was really anathema to a liberal who tended to believe in free trade. But that was that. The Liberal Unionists were less and less distinctively liberal. So Austen Chamberlain and Neville Chamberlain, they're both in Parliament at the same time. And indeed, Austen Chamberlain, around about 1912, he briefly served as a leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party, as they're officially called. And he was the only leader of the Conservative Party, apart from William Hague, in the 20th century, who did not become Prime Minister. So that's a dubious distinction. And he was pushed out Andrew Bonar-Law came in as leader. But he was still a prominent figure and held other cabinet positions in the 1920s. So this pair of brothers, or half-brothers to be more accurate, were a dynamic duo in the 1920s. Later on in the 20s, Neville Chamberlain, he served as Minister for Health, and indeed he opened Gunnersbury Park in London to encourage people to perambulate and take a bit of light exercise. So he was just too old for service in the First World War, but he advocated for finding that war. He was obviously horrified by the unspeakable suffering engendered by that war, and it gave him a detestation of war and a determination to avoid peace. So I won't go through all the political machinations of the Conservatives were out and Labour was in, and blah, blah, blah. But anyway, 1935, Stanley Baldwin was doing his second stint as Prime Minister. And 1937, he'd got the United Kingdom through the abdication crisis, and he decided it was time to call it quits. So he had seen the coronation of George VI. So he stood down. There was no formal leadership election as such. A leader just emerged within the Conservative Party, and Stanley Baldwin recommended to King George VI that he send for Neville Chamberlain as the new Prime Minister. So, as you may know, Adolf Hitler was the Chancellor and President of Germany at the time, and he was on the march, having remilitarized the Rhineland and so forth. So appeasement, was it to be, or what? Now, the United Kingdom did not have any military alliances with other countries in Europe at the time. So then 1938, was Germany going to take over Austria? And Adolf Hitler sent Reinhold Spitzy to the United Kingdom to ask Chamberlain what he would do, and so of course we'll oppose you, but we're not going to go to war over it. Remember, Anschluss, as in the unification of Austria and Germany, was explicitly forbidden under the Treaty of Versailles and the Treaty of Saint-Germain. Now, Germany has been breaking these treaties and getting away with it, and France, the United Kingdom, had largely slunk it off. So March 1938, German troops marched into Austria and met with an ecstatic reception. There's no doubt it was popular. Obviously, the Third Reich could point to the principle of national self-determination expounded by the US President Woodrow Wilson in January 1918 and say, well, this is, if Germans and Austrians choose to unite, that ought to be permitted under your own principle. Although London could riposte, no, we never espoused that principle. The Americans espoused that principle, which was true. Anyway, even Germans of moderate opinion tended not to accept Czechoslovakia as a legitimate country, but I'll come on to that in a moment. Anyway, there was a referendum held. I know it was on an unfair basis in Austria, but 99% of them voted ja to unification with Germany. Having said that, even if they had held it on a completely fair basis, I don't know a historian who doubts that unification would have won, though not by such a thumping great majority. So what to do? Now, Chamberlain, he consulted the chiefs of Imperial General Staff, who told him, if the United Kingdom fights a war against Germany, we will lose. There have been severe cutbacks in the British Armed Forces after the First World War. There was high unemployment. There was this huge deficit. There was this insurmountable debt to pay off to the United States in particular. There were so many widows and orphans, so many disabled soldiers and sailors from the Great War. And the UK was only lifting out of the Depression very slowly. Remember 1936, the Jarrow hunger marchers came down here to protest against mass unemployment in northern England. So then there was September 1938, when Adolf Hitler decided that he wanted the Sudetenland, which is the western edge of what's now the Czech Republic. In those days, Czechoslovakia existed. Slovakia and the Czech Republic were a single state, but there was a large German minority. About 20% of the population of that country were of the German ethnicity, and they lived in Bohemia, in the hills there, well now Sudetenland. And they were led by Konrad Henlein of the Sudeten German Party, even though he's actually half Czech himself. History's most famous PE teacher. And he campaigned for them to join Germany, and a high majority of Sudeten Germans were voting for that. Remember, this territory had previously been part of the Austrian Empire for centuries, so they say, well, as Austria has joined Germany, so should we. So what was going to happen? Now, France had a formal military alliance with Czechoslovakia. The United Kingdom did not. So for 3 consecutive weekends, Chamberlain flew to Germany to negotiate with Adolf Hitler. The French foreign minister was there as well, Edouard Daladier. And Mussolini, the Italian prime minister, he was there to mediate, and he spoke English, German, Italian, as well as French. So Chamberlain had never been on a plane in his life, and the Prime Minister leaving the country during his term of office was very rare indeed. So Hitler had nothing but disdain for Chamberlain, particularly because he carried an umbrella. He seemed just so unmanly, but Hitler publicly expressed his gratitude to Mr. Chamberlain for his efforts. So Hitler kept upping the demand, and people really ready for war. People often forget just how close the country came to war at the time. Reservists were called away from their ordinary jobs. They had to go up to the RAF, the Army, the Royal Navy. Trenches were dug in parks because that's where paratroopers would land if it came, and things like that. All military leave was cancelled. Gas masks were issued. They were preparing an evacuation plan to get civilians out of the major cities because they thought it'd be heavy bombing. Remember, the Spanish Civil War was raging at the time. There'd been Guernica, and Stanley Baldwin had said the bomber will always get through. They thought that the civilian casualties from bombing would be in the millions. Yes, there were civilian deaths, nothing like as bad as people had anticipated. Anyway, so the nation held its breath, and at the last minute an agreement was signed. So Chamberlain flew back to London Aerodrome, which is now the Croydon area, and he asked Alec Dunglass, should I show this piece of paper that Hitler has signed? And the Honourable Alec Dunglass said, I don't think you should actually. But Chamberlain chose to disregard that advice. So he gave out, and he landed and he gave a speech to the rapturous crowd saying, I have in my hand a signature, and it bears these piece of paper, and it bears the signature of Herr Hitler as well as mine, and it guarantees peace for our time, often misquoted as peace in our time. Anyway, the most elated cheer went up from the crowd, and you can see the relief etched on their faces because the world had held its breath. They thought it was going to be a Second World War, and it had been narrowly averted. So he was asked by the King and Queen to come onto the balcony of Buckingham Palace, and he was cheered to the echo by an ecstatic crowd. How delighted would you be? You know, only 20 years earlier, the bloodiest war that mankind had ever seen had just ended, and people did not want to go through that agony again. There's no doubt it was a very popular decision here, in France, in every country, and the UK was not willing to contemplate an alliance with the Soviet Union, nor with the Czechoslovaks. They said, if we let the Red Army in, we'll never get them out. So that was the next step. So having done that, he felt he bought time, and he ordered a massive rearmament. There'd be no remission and taxation, which many had hoped for. The Germans had forged ahead with military technology. The British had invented the tank, made them a bit complacent, and the French, they built their Maginot Line. They felt the last war was a trench war. If there were to be another war, it would be a static war. Well, they couldn't have been more wrong, because of course there'd been a revolution in military technology. There'd been such a breakthrough that really this was going to be a war of maneuver and speed. So the Germans were determined not to be fighting trench war again. So then March 1939, Adolf Hitler decided he'd like the remainder of what was Czechoslovakia. So he summoned the president to Berlin and said to Edvard Beneš that you must order your army to stand down, or the bombing will begin within 1 hour, and Prague will be flattened. Remember, the second city, Bratislava, was right on the Danube, so within sight of Austria, and it could be simply demolished by German artillery. By this stage, the Czechoslovaks, because of the unification of Germany and Austria, would have the enemy to their north, to their south, and to their west. They'd face the foe on all three sides, and so they had to give up. They'd already given up their good defense to the Sudetenland, that mountainous area, those thickly wooded hills. They'd had their barbed wire fences, their minefields, their machine gun nests, and their underground bunkers and all the rest of it. They'd already given away most of their industry, most of their hydroelectricity. So they would have put up something of a fight. Now, nobody doubts that they would have lost in 1938, but if they'd been ably assisted by the French and British attacking Germany in the west, well then, that might have made the Third Reich back down. And indeed, some anti-Nazi German army officers were here in this country, speaking to Peter Usanov's father, trying to persuade the French and British to have some backbone, and they'd launch a military putsch against Hitler. I don't think it would have succeeded. I mean, it didn't succeed in 1944. It certainly wouldn't have worked in 1938, when Hitler was at the height of his powers and popularity. So that was that. So having been badly let down by Hitler, Chamberlain issued the Polish guarantee. Remember, France already had a formed military alliance with the Poles, but how was this possibly to be honoured? And the United Kingdom took the unprecedented step of introducing peacetime conscription. There were lots of unemployed young men, so they were taken first. And that was partly to demonstrate to the French that the United Kingdom was serious, actually had a spine about this. So, and also a delegation was sent to the Soviet Union to discuss whether there could be an alliance with them, but it came to naught because the Soviets would like some of Eastern Poland, which had formerly been the territory of Tsarist Russia. Moreover, the property classes find it unthinkable to conclude an alliance with the Bolsheviks. So then Joachim Ribbentrop, the German foreign minister, he bragged that he was about to pull off a diplomatic defeat of England such as had not been seen since the 18th century. And there was a most extraordinary démarche when he flew to Moscow on the 23rd of August 1939 to sign the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in the presence of Stalin. The 10-year non-aggression pact with the secret annexes thereto sealed the fate of Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Moldova, and so forth. So the 1st of September 1939, well, we know what happened. Some concentration camp prisoners were taken to the German-Polish border, dressed in Polish army uniforms and shot dead by the German army near a German radio station after a broadcast in Polish had briefly made. So the Germans opened fire at 5:45 a.m. So Hitler went on the radio saying that they'd been attacked unprovokedly by the Poles. That was a double lie. Incidentally, so German commanders had already been active in Poland for a few days, setting off bombs in railway stations, and the German warship Schleswig-Holstein was then on a courtesy visit to the Polish city of Gdansk and again had opened fire. So the world knew about it. There was a British journalist, this woman, she only died a couple of years ago, was there, and she phoned the Foreign Office to tell them what was happening and saying, and here are the tanks. You hear that on the phone? You hear that? As they're rolling by. Of course, the world didn't know that Hitler's claims were false at that time. They were bogus, but people couldn't be certain of that, first of all. So therefore, on the 3rd of September, the British ambassador in Berlin, Sir Arthur Henderson, he handed Herr Hitler a note saying that unless the German government indicated by 11 o'clock that morning that they would immediately withdraw from Poland, then His Majesty the King would declare war on the Third Reich. And the deadline expired. Several hours later, the French also declared war. So Hitler was stunned. His foreign minister Ribbentrop had convinced him there was no way on earth the British would do this. They had no stomach from the fight. They were just so traumatized by the First World War, and why should they care about Poland? They hadn't cared about Czechoslovakia, a faraway country of which we know little, so said Neville Chamberlain some years before. He said that the United Kingdom was an oceanic power, not a continental one, and so it was just simply not in the UK's interest to fight, and they were kind of fairly pacifistic and all the rest of it. They were so similar to the Germans, they couldn't really believe it. They're fighting the wrong war. So that's that. Neville Chamberlain. I won't go through much how the war went, but his first wartime broadcast was deeply uninspiring, saying, "It comes as a bitter blow to me, and I strove to maintain the peace, but I can't think of anything I could have done differently to stay at peace." Anyway, it was all going very badly. The Norway campaign in May 1940, when Germany had invaded Norway, Vidkun Quisling, the leader of the Nationalsamling, this fascist party there, he overthrew the government at the same time, although he was quite unpopular, and the Germans didn't use him as much of a puppet leader. Anyway, the French and British rushed their troops to Norway, but it was all to little avail, and eventually they had to be evacuated, and the Norwegian royal family came here to London and formed their court in exile. But what was the next thing? You can actually see where they used to live. So it was a defeat for France and the UK and Norway. However, they did sink several German capital ships, and the German surface fleet was never able to challenge the Royal Navy for the rest of the war. And there were the Norway debates in the House of Commons, and Chamberlain was barracked at, "For God's sake, go." I think it was Leo Amory said, famously quoting Cromwell's words to the Long Parliament. So that was that. His authority had been fatally undermined. A lot of Tory MPs wanted to keep him in situ, but a minority of Tories plus the Labour Party, they pressurised him to stand down. He knew he'd lose a vote of confidence, so he went to the palace and tendered his resignation to George VI. I'm not quite sure how George VI happened to choose Winston Churchill. Was it on the recommendation of the outgoing Prime Minister? Because usually that was the case. The monarch would always act on the advice of the Prime Minister, and Churchill wasn't actually leader of the Conservative Party at that time. He subsequently became so. The choice was between him and the Earl of Halifax, who ironically lived directly across the square. You can't see it from here, but if you go to 100 metres through the park, you'd get to the house of the Earl of Halifax, formerly Viceroy of India. So Churchill was chosen. No sooner had he retired than it turned out that Neville Chamberlain realised he was fatally ill with cancer, and he died in November 1940. So if he hadn't resigned, he would have died en poste anyway. There was his funeral at Westminster Abbey, and Churchill said it was a good thing that the Germans don't know about this, because if the Luftwaffe were to leave its calling card, that would be our leadership decapitated. So there he is. He's gone down as a sorrowful figure, as someone who is pathetic, but I think we have to hand it to him. He did his best to keep the peace. He was trying to avoid a war in which tens of millions of people would be killed. Anyone could tell you that. This was a war involving superpowers. This is a war involving bombers which were of an unprecedented destructive capacity. So surely it was the noblest possible cause to do everything he possibly could to avoid peace. So don't judge him too harshly. He was a man who did what he believed was right.